Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of UBS Road to the Election, an Election Watch series. I'm thrilled to welcome my guest to the studio today, Alejo Czerwonko, Chief Investment Officer of Emerging Markets Americas here at UBS. Welcome, Alejo. Great to have you in the studio with me.
It's great to be here.
This is quite an interesting election cycle, as you know, and here we are as we're sitting here. It's just a couple of weeks out from Election Day, and even as our own Tom McLaughlin said to me earlier, early voting starts in October. So really, there's only a few weeks left before we get into this. But we're going to take the angle today of what's happening on the emerging market side, and I think specifically is the question of why do U.S. elections matter for emerging markets? And I think most people would say, well, of course that makes sense. That seems like a pretty easy answer, but it's much more nuanced than that. So what do you say when people ask you that question?
Look, Anthony, we are having an election in the largest economy in the world, the country that spends the most globally on military. The dollar remains king. It is the global reserve currency. Over 60% of foreign exchange reserves in foreign central banks are denominated in US dollars. And the US has the deepest and most liquid capital markets in the world. So just about any global leader out there is looking at what's going on in the United States very attentively. When I talk to clients offshore, question number one, number two, and number three is usually about the U.S. election.
Right. Yeah, it's not surprising to hear that earlier on this year when we were tasked with putting this show together, a lot of the requests were coming from our colleagues overseas. And our senior leaders are there because they see that as far as U.S. elections are concerned, everybody pays attention because it is so far-reaching. But if you look back historically at U.S. elections and the relationship between our elections here and emerging markets, what does the history tell you?
What you see typically is that around election day, there's a pickup in asset class volatility, be it equities, bonds, or currencies from the emerging world. They start to get a little jittery, right? Historically, this is not long-lasting. It is only temporary as a phenomenon. But, this time could be different. We're talking about two candidates with vastly different policy proposals. And so everybody's waiting to see whether historical patterns apply or we're going to see something new.
Yeah, we keep using the word unprecedented every time we sit down and have a conversation about this election cycle. And certainly there are a lot of unprecedented moments that have happened. But now we know we've got former President Trump, we've got Vice President Harris, they're fighting to the finish. We just finished watching the Democratic National Convention, so now it's really off to the races. Knowing what we know about the policies that are already being discussed by both candidates, and obviously things will change over time. How do you envision this specific election affecting EM?
The way I think about it is the U.S. election will impact emerging markets through three main channels. Number one, the way the election shapes U.S. macroeconomic variables, right? Number two, the way the U.S. election shapes the global trade environment. And finally, you're thinking about the global geopolitical implication from this election. In other words, whoever wins will have an impact on U.S. growth, inflation, interest rates, and the overall direction of the dollar. Whoever wins will decide, will the U.S. impose more, higher, or lower tariffs, right, as a policy tool. And whoever wins will have a say on whether the U.S. gets along better or worse vis-a-vis key partners, Mexico, China, India, Brazil, Russia, the Middle East at large, right? All this matters. On balance, we think a Republican victory will be more conducive of higher growth in the United States. This is good for emerging markets, at least historically. Now, at the same time, a Republican victory will come hand in hand with higher interest rates, maybe a stronger dollar, both of which tend to tighten financial conditions, make money a little bit harder to come by in emerging markets. This is not great. Maybe most importantly, a Republican victory might yield to higher volatility when it comes to trade policy and geopolitics. And investors rarely want to allocate more capital to emerging markets when there's a lot of noise in the trade and geopolitical arena. All in, I think a Republican victory might introduce a bit more headwinds relative to tailwinds for emerging markets.
Right, because obviously one of the things that people are really talking about is former President Trump's proposal of 10% tariffs across the board on developed countries like Canada and also emerging market countries. I'm sure that has to play a role in somewhat of the impact you could potentially have.
Without a doubt, and more recently, a 20% number has been floated, right? And this is across the board, no matter the country of origin. We think this could be, from an economic perspective, quite disruptive.
So let's talk about the three that you mentioned a couple of different emerging market countries, but it seems like the three that are most potentially impacted are Mexico, China, and India. Three superpowers all in their own right as far as economically speaking and looking at their GDP. Looking at each of those countries specifically, how does our election here impact them specifically?
Let's start with Mexico.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that electoral rhetoric will impact Mexican assets in coming months. Mexico will likely be in the crosshairs when it comes to trade and immigration, right? That said, when you look through the noise, think about 2025 and beyond, I think that irrespective of who wins, the nature of the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship will continue to grow in importance because of nearshoring. These are two economies that are tied at the hip, and we believe deeper penetration and integration between both nations will take place. Moving on to China, it's a different story. We're looking at a secular rise in bilateral tensions. I think we will be standing here a few years down the road, and it's not going to have gotten much better. Right? Now, of course, if Trump wins, the way they will interact will be different than if Harris wins. But nonetheless, you'll see tensions. This is a topic that both sides of the aisle, of the political aisle in the U.S., agree on.
Right. In your research and in your assessment of these things, as you say, that tension, regardless of the winner, doesn't really just go away between the U.S. and China.
Exactly.
Right.
And then you've got India, right? A country I like to call the geopolitical swing state, right? Because it is right in between China and the United States. It's large enough that the country is able to extract concessions from different sides, and it's very well positioned to take advantage from this multipolar geopolitical world we're living in. So I think India, irrespective of who wins, enjoys secular opportunities.
And going back to Mexico for a moment, they just had a massive election there where by not a landslide, but by a large margin, they've elected into a new president. Does that new president give any kind of feelings about what that relationship might be with either Harris or Trump? Do we have any sense of what that might look like?
You shouldn't be shy. President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum won by a landslide.
So you could call it a landslide.
Absolutely.
I want to make sure I wasn't overstating that.
No worries. And look, I think she understands the importance of the relationship with the United States, and she will be willing to work with Harris or with Trump. It's not clear, one side or another is going to be a better outcome. It is the reality of Mexico's situation. No matter who sits in the White House, you're going to have to play ball.
Right, exactly. Alejo, thank you very much. Always appreciate you coming by, and good stuff. And let's also be clear that in the rest of the world, there have been many and will continue to be more elections. This was one of the most, I think, one of the years that had the most elections globally in our recent history.
Over 80 countries, over half the world population went to the polls to elect new leaders. The mother of all battles is still ahead of us.
That's right. The grand event, as we say. And Alejo, thank you very much. Good to see you, my friend.
Great to be here.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us as well. If you'd like more information, please visit the website, ubs.com/election watch. We've got other episodes in this series there, plus lots of other election-related content. And of course, we encourage you to continue this conversation with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We'll see you soon.